Dr. Elena Marlowe gazed at the holographic display in the heart of the Lyra Institute's control room. Her tired eyes reflected the swirling vortex of light and matter projected above the console. A wormhole, stable and humming with an eerie, almost sentient presence. Years of work, endless calculations, and sleepless nights had culminated in this moment. Yet, the thrill of success was dampened by an unshakable unease that pressed against the edges of her mind. "Energy levels holding steady," said Dr. Jonas Patel, his voice tight with concentration. He adjusted the controls, his fingers trembling slightly. "We've got a solid connection. Readings are, well, they're strange, but within expected parameters." The control room was alive with muted chaos, scientists murmuring to one another, data scrolling across screens, and the faint hum of machinery. Technician Sawyer Briggs leaned against a console, arms crossed, watching the wormhole with a mix of awe and skepticism. "Weirdest thing I've ever seen," he muttered, shaking his head. "Looks alive, doesn't it?" Elena didn't answer. Her focus remained on the readings flooding her console. Magnetic field distortions, quantum fluctuations. It was all as predicted. Yet there was something else buried in the noise. A pattern. Organic? No, that couldn't be right. "Elena," Patel said, breaking her train of thought. "We're picking up trace signals. They're faint, but they're not static." "What kind of signals?" Elena asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Oscillations in the radio spectrum, almost like bioelectric pulses." Patel hesitated, glancing at her. "It's as if something's responding to us." The room fell silent. Even Briggs stopped his sarcastic muttering, his gaze shifting uneasily between Patel and the vortex. Elena felt a chill crawl up her spine. She knew better than to let excitement cloud her judgment, but this was unprecedented. If there was something alive on the other side, it would change everything. "Send the probe," Elena said finally. She saw Patel's hesitation and added, "We need data." It's the next logical step. The probe, a sleek drone bristling with sensors and cameras, slid into position. A collective breath seemed to hold in the room as the drone was swallowed by the wormhole, its lights vanishing into the swirling abyss. A moment later, the screens flickered to life, displaying a feed from the other side. Gasps rippled through the room. The drone's cameras revealed a landscape that defied explanation. The ground pulsed faintly, like the surface of a living organism, its texture a mosaic of gelatinous and fibrous materials. Towering structures that seemed half organic, half crystalline loomed in the distance, pulsating with dim, rhythmic light. Strange motes of phosphorescence floated through the air, casting shifting shadows across the alien terrain. "Are those structures?" Patel murmured, leaning closer to the screen. "Biological structures," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mind raced, cataloging every detail. The environment was alive in a way that defied Earth's biology. And the signals, they were stronger now, more complex, rhythmic, almost musical. "Wait," Briggs said, pointing at one of the screens. "What the hell is that?" The room collectively leaned forward. At the edge of the feed, something moved, just a flicker of motion. A shadow darting between the crystalline spires. It was fast, almost too fast for the probe to track, but it was there. "Can you isolate it?" Elena asked. Patel's fingers flew over the console, but the feed stuttered. The probe's telemetry data began to spike, erratic signals pouring in faster than the system could process. Then, abruptly, the screens went dark. "Probe lost," Briggs announced grimly. "What happened?" Elena demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Unknown. It could be interference, but..." Patel stopped, staring at his console. "Wait. The wormhole. It's destabilizing. We're seeing fluctuations in the energy field." "Shut it down," Elena ordered. Patel hesitated, his hands hovering over the controls. "But the data..." "Shut it down." Elena's tone brooked no argument. Patel activated the shutdown sequence, and the wormhole collapsed with a soundless implosion, leaving only the hum of cooling systems in its wake. The room was silent, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Elena stared at the empty space where the vortex had been, her mind replaying the fleeting images from the probe. Something had been there, watching, waiting. "We need a full debrief," she said, finally addressing the room. "Every piece of data analyzed, no exceptions." The team dispersed reluctantly, their excitement tempered by unease. Elena lingered, staring at the console. The signals hadn't stopped when the wormhole closed. They were faint, barely detectable, but they were still there, scratching at the edges of perception, like a whisper in the dark. For the first time, Elena questioned whether they had truly closed the door or simply left it ajar. The first signs were subtle, easy to dismiss. Dr. Jonas Patel complained of an odd itch under his skin, a sharp prickle in his forearm he attributed to exhaustion or stress. Technician Sawyer Briggs, normally unshakable, started reacting to phantom sounds, faint, high-pitched tones that no one else could hear. Dr. Elena Marlowe watched it all with growing unease, but said nothing, chalking it up to post-experiment tension. They had just opened a door to another dimension. Nerves were bound to fray. But by the third day, it was impossible to ignore. Patel's itch had worsened, his forearm swelling to twice its normal size. He showed Elena the discolored lump beneath his skin, a livid, pulsating mass that moved when touched. "It feels like something's alive in there," he said, his voice cracking. Elena's stomach churned, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Get to medical," she said. "Now." Patel nodded and stumbled off, clutching his arm. Moments later, Briggs burst into the control room, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "It's in the walls," he hissed. "The sound. It's everywhere now, like it's crawling." "Get a hold of yourself, Briggs," Elena snapped, though her own hands trembled. "We've been through high-stress scenarios before. This is no different." "No, this is different," Briggs insisted, backing away from her. "You don't hear it, do you? It's like it's calling to me." Elena turned to the others, but their faces mirrored her own confusion and fear. Whatever was happening, it wasn't stress. It was something else. Something they had brought back with them. By the time Patel returned from medical, his condition had worsened. The lump on his arm had grown darker, its surface stretched taut and glossy. He collapsed in the lab, writhing in agony as his colleagues scrambled to help. Before anyone could reach him, The lump split open with a wet, sickening sound. A cluster of spindly, translucent appendages erupted from his arm, twitching and probing the air. Patel's screams cut through the facility like a knife. The appendages grew rapidly, branching out from his flesh like grotesque roots. His skin cracked and peeled away in strips, revealing slick, chitinous plates beneath. His eyes, wide with terror, flicked to Elena. "Help me," he gasped, before his voice dissolved into an inhuman gurgle. The others froze in horror, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Elena forced herself to act. "Quarantine the lab," she shouted. "Now!" Technicians scrambled to seal the room, the heavy blast doors slamming shut with a resounding clang. Inside, Patel's transformation continued. His body convulsed, twisting into something alien. His limbs lengthened unnaturally, and his fingers fused into sharp, blade-like structures. The thing that had been Jonas Patel reared up, its distorted face turned toward the observation window, its multifaceted eyes gleaming with a malevolent intelligence. Then it attacked. The creature threw itself against the glass, cracks spidering across the surface with each impact. Elena backed away, her heart pounding. "Everyone out of here," she ordered. The team scattered, fleeing the lab as an alarm blared through the facility. Elena stayed behind, staring at the creature through the failing glass. She saw no trace of Patel in the thing's jerky movements, its primal ferocity. Whatever was happening to him, it was spreading, and it wasn't going to stop. That night, the whispers began. Elena heard them first while reviewing the lab footage, soft, insistent murmurs that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of her breath. She tried to dismiss them, but they grew louder, filling the silence of her office until she slammed her hands over her ears. She wasn't the only one. Briggs reported hearing the whispers too, though his had taken on a sinister edge. "They're speaking to me," he said, his voice trembling, "telling me to let them in." Elena realized too late that Briggs was already compromised. She found him in the main corridor, clawing at the walls as though trying to tear through the metal. His hands were bleeding, the flesh beneath his nails blackened and peeling. He turned to her, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "It's inside me," he whispered. "I can feel it growing." The facility descended into chaos. More team members began exhibiting symptoms, lesions on their skin, sudden bursts of aggression, strange growths emerging from their bodies. Some were taken to medical, but there was no cure, no containment. The infected turned on the uninfected, their bodies twisted into grotesque, half-human forms that moved with unnatural speed and strength. Elena and a handful of others barricaded themselves in the control room, their hope dwindling with each passing hour. The facility's systems were failing, overrun by surges of power that seemed deliberate, as though the parasites themselves were learning to manipulate their environment. Elena stared at the readouts on her console, her mind racing. The spores they had found on the probe, the organic signals from the other side, they weren't remnants of the alien world. They were seeds, and they were growing. The silence in the control room was suffocating, broken only by the faint, rhythmic thrum emanating from the facility's core. Dr. Elena Marlowe sat hunched over a console, her mind racing as she sifted through the fractured data logs. Around her, the remaining survivors, 4 now, including herself, kept watch, their faces pale and streaked with exhaustion. Every sound beyond the steel doors sent a jolt through their nerves, each creak of the metal a reminder of what was lurking outside. "They're learning," said Sawyer Briggs, his voice barely above a whisper. He was slumped against the wall, his shirt soaked with sweat. The early signs of infection were visible now, a faint gray tinge creeping along his veins, the occasional twitch in his fingers that he tried to hide. "They know we're in here. They're waiting." Elena ignored him, her focus locked on the patterns in the data. She replayed footage from the lab breach, freezing the frames to examine the creature's movements. They weren't mindless, she realized. There was coordination in their attacks, a purpose. The more she watched, the clearer it became. The parasites weren't just invading. They were building something. "They're using us," Elena murmured, her voice trembling with realization. She turned to Briggs and the others. "The transformations, it's not random. They're repurposing our bodies, turning us into tools." "What the hell are you talking about?" asked Linda Cho, the facilities engineer, her voice sharp with fear. "Tools for what?" Elena gestured to the screen, overlaying a schematic of the facility with the movements of the infected. "Look, every breach, every attack, they're focused on the reactor, the wormhole generator. They're not just spreading, they're restructuring the environment." "You mean like a hive?" Briggs asked, his voice strained. Elena nodded grimly. "Exactly. They're creating a hive, a biomechanical system designed to sustain them. They're merging with the facility, adapting it to their needs." Cho stared at the screen, her face pale. "If they take the generator, if they stabilize the wormhole, they could spread beyond the facility." "That's the point," Elena said. "This was never an accident. The wormhole wasn't just a doorway, it was a lure, designed to attract intelligent life to open it. Once we brought the spores back, we triggered their invasion." A loud metallic crash echoed through the corridor, cutting the conversation short. The survivors froze, their breaths shallow as they listened. The sound came again, closer this time. A wet, scraping noise followed, like something being dragged across the floor. Elena grabbed a makeshift weapon, a steel rod scavenged from the maintenance bay. The others armed themselves with whatever they could find: a fire extinguisher, a scalpel, a wrench. The door buckled under a heavy impact, the metal groaning as something slammed into it, repeatedly. Through the reinforced glass, Elena caught a glimpse of what was on the other side. It had once been Dr. Jonas Patel, but now its body was a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and alien material. Its elongated arms ended in jagged, blade-like appendages, and its face was a hollowed-out mask, the features replaced with a pulsating, membranous surface. "They're testing us," Elena whispered, gripping the rod tighter. "They're trying to find a way in." Before anyone could respond, the door gave way and chaos erupted. The creature lunged into the room, its movements unnervingly fast. Briggs tackled it, his strength fueled by desperation. But the creature's appendages tore into his side, sending a spray of blood across the consoles. "Go!" Briggs screamed, his voice a guttural roar. "Get to the core. Stop them." Elena hesitated, her heart wrenching at the sight of her colleague writhing beneath the creature's claws. But she knew he was right. "Come on," she shouted to the others, grabbing Cho and pulling her toward the emergency exit. The last survivor, Alex Moore, a junior technician, followed, his face pale with terror. They sprinted down the corridor, the sounds of Briggs's struggle fading behind them. As they ran, the environment around them began to change. The once sterile walls of the facility were now covered in a slick, organic film that pulsed faintly with light. Tubular growths jutted from the ceiling, leaking viscous fluid onto the floor. The air was thick with a cloying, metallic scent that clung to their lungs. "They're turning the whole place into this," Cho said, her voice trembling. "It's not just the facility," Elena said, her mind racing. "They're transforming it into a node, a part of their hive network. If they finish, there won't be anything left of us." They reached the reactor chamber, the massive wormhole generator looming in the center. The room was already partially overtaken, the machinery enmeshed with alien growths. Tendrils snaked along the floor, pulsating as though alive. In the center of the chamber, a cluster of infected stood motionless, their bodies fused into a grotesque lattice of flesh and metal. The generator's hum had changed, its pitch now resonating with an eerie, otherworldly tone. "They're stabilizing it," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If they succeed, we're done." Cho stepped forward, her hands shaking as she assessed the generator. "We can overload it," she said, "force it to collapse." "Can you do it?" Elena asked. Cho nodded, but her expression was grim. "It'll take time. You'll need to hold them off." Before Elena could respond, the infected stirred. Their heads turned in unison, their lifeless eyes locking onto the intruders. One by one, they began to move, their grotesque forms shuddering as they broke free from the lattice. "Do it," Elena said, gripping her rod. "We'll buy you time." As Cho dove into the controls, Elena and Moore braced themselves against the advancing horde. The fight was brutal, each strike of the rod met with the sickening crunch of flesh and bone. But the infected were relentless, their bodies refusing to succumb even as they were torn apart. Behind them, Cho worked frantically, her fingers flying over the console. "Almost there," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Elena swung the rod again, her arms burning with exhaustion. She knew they couldn't hold out much longer, but she also knew they had no choice. If they failed here, the parasites would spread, consuming everything in their path. The reactor chamber was in chaos, a nightmare of alien flesh and ruptured machinery. Tendrils slithered along the walls, merging with the circuitry, their pulsating rhythms synchronized with the wormhole's unholy hum. The infected swarmed closer, their twisted forms moving with purpose, as if guided by a single malevolent will. Elena Marlowe tightened her grip on the bloodied steel rod in her hand. She felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, but there was no time to stop. The wormhole was stabilizing, its shimmering vortex growing brighter, louder, more alive with every second. If they didn't stop it now, it would open fully, unleashing the hive onto the world beyond. Behind her, Linda Cho worked feverishly at the control panel, her face pale and streaked with sweat. Sparks rained down from the ceiling as the machinery groaned under the strain of its corrupted transformation. "I just need a few more minutes," Cho shouted, her voice shaking but resolute. "We don't have a few minutes," Elena yelled back, swinging the rod in a desperate arc. It collided with the closest infected, a creature whose torso had split into writhing tendrils that lashed out blindly. The impact sent a sickening tremor through Elena's arms, but the creature barely staggered. It turned its grotesque face toward her, and she saw the faintest remnants of Alex Moore in its glassy eyes. Her stomach twisted. Another infected charged from the side, a blur of chitin and muscle. Elena ducked, feeling the rush of air as its blade-like limbs swiped inches from her face. She jabbed upward with the rod, piercing the soft tissue beneath its jaw. The creature let out a shrill, unearthly screech before collapsing, but Elena knew it wouldn't stay down for long. "Hold them off," Cho screamed, her hands flying across the console. "I've almost overridden the containment protocols." Elena didn't respond. She couldn't. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her vision blurring as she swung and dodged, every movement a fight against the encroaching swarm. The infected were relentless, their bodies twisting and contorting to close the distance. She could feel the hive's intelligence pressing down on her, probing her thoughts, whispering promises of relief if she just gave in. And then, amid the chaos, she saw him. Sawyer Briggs staggered into the chamber, his body warped beyond recognition. His skin was mottled and stretched, patches of it replaced with hard, glistening exoskeleton. His left arm was a mass of jagged spines, while his right still held a faint semblance of humanity. His face was a fractured mask, one eye human, the other a black faceted orb that gleamed with alien light. "Elena." His voice was a guttural rasp, distorted but unmistakably his. "It's too late." Elena froze, her heart lurching. "Briggs?" she whispered. He took a halting step toward her, his movements jerky and unnatural. "You can't stop it," he said, his voice trembling with pain. "They're in everything. They'll take everything." "No," Elena said, her voice rising in defiance. "We can stop this. We have to." Briggs let out a choked, agonized laugh. "You don't understand. I can feel them. They're inside me, inside all of us. They're connected. They'll never stop." Behind her, Cho let out a triumphant cry. "I've got it. The overload sequence is primed." The generator let out a deafening roar as its systems began to destabilize. The wormhole flickered, its shimmering surface writhing as if in agony. The infected around them recoiled, their movements growing erratic. But Briggs didn't flinch. Instead, he staggered closer, his grotesque form trembling. "Elena," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "They won't let you leave. Not alive." Elena's chest tightened. She looked at Briggs, at the pain etched into the remnants of his face, and knew he was right. The hive would not allow its prey to escape. Even if the wormhole was destroyed, the spores were still here. The infection would find a way to survive, to spread. She turned to Cho, who was frantically working to stabilize the overload. "Linda," Elena said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Can the system be manually detonated?" Cho looked up, her eyes widening in alarm. "Manually? Elena, no, there's no way you'd make it out." "I know," Elena interrupted, her voice firm, "but it's the only way to make sure." Cho's hands faltered on the controls. "There has to be another." "There isn't," Elena snapped. She stepped closer, gripping Cho's shoulder. "You need to get out of here. Seal the exit behind you. Make sure the spores don't leave this place." Cho stared at her, tears welling in her eyes, but she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Elena turned back to Briggs. He stood motionless now, watching her with a strange, alien calm. "I'll finish it," she said, her voice barely audible. She stepped toward the generator, weaving through the chaos as the infected swarmed around her. They seemed to hesitate, as if sensing her intent. The hive's whispers grew louder, a cacophony of promises and threats, but she forced herself to block them out. At the console, Elena activated the manual override. The reactor's core began to glow, its energy building to a critical point. The air grew thick with heat and static, and the wormhole flickered violently, its edges collapsing inward. The infected screamed, their bodies convulsing as the hive's connection faltered. Briggs let out a final guttural roar, his form disintegrating into a mass of writhing tendrils. Elena stood firm, her hands steady on the controls. As the countdown reached 0, she closed her eyes. The explosion tore through the facility, a blinding flash of light and heat that consumed everything in its path. The wormhole collapsed in on itself, the alien landscape vanishing in an instant. The infected were obliterated, their twisted forms reduced to ash. Above the Arctic tundra, the ground shuddered, and then silence. The Lyra Institute was gone, erased from existence. In the stillness, the wind carried a single, faintly glowing spore, drifting upward toward the endless expanse of sky.